Hello, in this video, we are going to piggyback off of the previous video and utilize our MITRE data to make some checks within our documentation. Okay, so if you remember in the last video, we now have a MITRE mapped object that, given a certain technique ID, will print out all the associated information. So what we want to do is navigate to our validation.py script and copy and paste the code that we made before. And if you notice, our libraries are not importing, so we're going to have to get those in here as well. All right, so just double checking this, what we can do. As a reminder, we have the data that prints out properly, okay? So now that we have all our MITRE data available and we have all our file data available, the question is, how do we set this up so we can iterate over the data and make the checks that we need? So to start, what I think would be helpful is to look at one of these alerts here. Doesn't really matter which one, they all should function the same way. So if we scroll up to the top here, under rules, we have these threats. You can see there's some like .technique, .subtechnique, .tactic, okay? Well, we can iterate over this data. So let's see what that looks like. Run that one more time. There we go. All right, so we can see all the technique, subtechnique, tactic data all in here, okay? And if we notice, one common theme is they all use the MITRE attack framework, and that's declared in here. What we can do is filter on that and make sure that we're only looking at MITRE attack data. So to do that, we're going to say threat framework should do something like this, and we're going to get an error. Okay, this is a little hard to visualize looking at it in this format, but the question is, how come we couldn't narrow things down in this explicit way? So the easiest way to kind of figure this out is to comment this out. We're going to set up another loop here. And this is what we saw before, right? So the question is, why can't we easily narrow down to framework? And the easiest way to figure this out is go down one more layer. And we can see that we do have to filter down to hit that layer that contains framework. So one way to do this is to add this in here. And now we can say print X. And we have the same values here. So instead of looping over the data again, we're now declaring that in here. And how to apply that to our statement. We could do something like this. And now we could have a statement, something like this. That if we run, if you remember a couple minutes ago, we did see this data just printing it out in our very first loop, but now we're ensuring that the data we're looking at is MITRE attack data. So now that we can access this data, what we want to do is to declare some variables to have the data more easily accessible for when we start making some checks. Okay, so instead of X, I'm going to make this a little bit more descriptive, call it threat. And now we're going to make some variables for technique ID and technique name. Okay. And now we're going to dig into the data. Okay, now let's make sure this works. Okay, now we can see our files, the technique, and technique name. And what we can do is just verify one of these here. So if we go into our custom alerts folder and just grab any one of these. So we're in Posh audio capture here. We should see audio capture and command and scripting interpreter. And we can see audio capture as a technique. And then we can see command and scripting interpreter as a technique here. And that's exactly what we want to see. So next up, we want to make a check to make sure that tactics exist. All right, so we can say if tactic exists in threat. What we want to do is test this as well. And I realized I deleted my print statement. So we're going to go back here really quick. And fix that. Let's put the tactic right in front. And run. Okay, and we have our tactics now across all three. If we wanted to account for the possibility where tactics don't exist, could do something along these lines here. It's not going to return any extra data for us, but this is an optional field depending on if you want to enforce tactic use or not, or if you're only concerned about the techniques. So it depends on how you want to chop up the data and what you want to do with it. I'm going to leave this in here for now, but just know that you don't need this if you want to enforce tactics, because then we would have to throw an error for a tactic not existing. So continuing down in our priority list here. So now we have techniques, we have tactics. The next point of comparison is sub-techniques. All right. Comment this out for now. So we're going to say if sub-technique is in the threat, technique, and similar to what we did before, we have to go down another layer. And I think the best way to illustrate this might be to find one of these options that have a technique. Okay, so let's take this guy right here. And let's put this in the JavaScript beautifier. So this is the data that we're parsing through, and this is why we have to go down more layers than you might think. So in the example here, we're saying in this thread data, okay, look in technique, and then look down into this array. Okay, and then print thread. But what you'll notice is when we see this array being used, meaning the square brackets here, that implies we have to put in that 0 to go down another layer. All right, so what that means is if we're making a sub-technique variable, we're narrowing it down into sub-technique, which is here. Okay, but then we have to do it again in order to get the ID and the name. All right, so we're going to do another 0, and then we're going to do ID. And then we're going to do name. And now what we can do is print this out. We need 2 more checks here, so let's chuck these in. If you notice, our script looks like it works on face value, but we can see some of these like audio capture shouldn't actually have this as a variable. And the reason this is happening is because we didn't account for the fact a subtechnique might not always exist. Okay, so we can do an else statement. And just put some variables in here. So now when we run it again, we can see that audio capture and screen capture are now represented accordingly. So now we essentially have all our data that we're going to compare to MITRE. So what we're going to do, and this is very similar to how we made this lookup right here, we're going to create a lookup for our alert data. And I'm going to copy and paste this since we've already seen this logic before, but I'll walk through it in a second here. Okay, so this example is a little bit more complex than the one we have up here. So if you remember in MITRE, we're making a quick check on the deprecated value and then essentially hard coding a value if it doesn't exist. In this scenario, we're inserting all the fields that we care about. Okay, but the problem here is the key that we're using is the file. So we need some concept of appending. If we didn't append the data into an array, what would happen is the very last item would overwrite it every single time, okay, which we don't want. It works up here when we're talking about MITRE techniques because the data that we're working with is unique to the ID. But down here, we might have multiple filtered objects, which essentially are line items here, okay, and you can see that we have a one-to-many relationship, so we need to append. Okay, what does this all look like now that it's all said and done? Big dump here. Let's put this in our beautifier. And looking at our data here, while it is formatted very neatly, we can tell upon closer inspection that we have more techniques and tactics for each file that should exist. And if you notice, they're actually repeating. So we have a problem with our script. If we look into our data here, we can see that the problem is actually in this array, because what's happening is we're appending this filtered object each time into the array. Okay, but the problem is we need a new array for each file. So what we can do is up here, when we reopen a file, we can redeclare the array and clear it out. Okay. We can actually remove it from here. So let's try to run this again. Maybe one more time. There we go. Let's put this back in the beautifier. Okay, here's what we want to look at. All right. And now we have our expected lists of tactics to the alerts. Okay. And back to our script. So at this point, we now have two containers of information that we can start comparing. So we have our MITRE mapped, which is all the confirmed MITRE data that we care about. And then we have our alert data, which iterates through all our detection documentation and creates a container that we can compare against. This video is getting a little long for how much we have left. I'm going to make this part 1 of validating MITRE data in our TOML. And then in part 2, we're going to utilize the two containers that we have and start making some data validation checks. All right. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you in the next video.